For all my life, I've heard about the amazing things that God is doing in China. I've heard about the church there, especially the underground church, and how despite times of real suffering and persecution, the church has thrived there with millions and millions of people coming to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. I knew that I needed to travel to China to learn how the story began, and knew that the story could not be told apart from Hudson Taylor. We're a couple hours outside Shanghai, and we're looking to track down Hudson Taylor's burial place. There's a pretty good story behind it, and I'll tell you as we go here. This is the town of Junzheng, which is about an hour and a half from Shanghai. I've come a very long way to be here. Let me tell you how I got here. It was maybe almost a couple of years ago. I was in Germany, and I was thinking about this project. I was trying to figure out how I could find objects around the world. I really wanted to find something related to Hudson Taylor, and I'd looked far and wide and just couldn't find any objects that were connected to him. Well, there in Germany, I stumbled across this Chinese couple, and they said, "We may be able to help you. We know Hudson Taylor IV, the great-grandson of Hudson Taylor." And so they put me in touch with him, and he told me about this. He said that Hudson Taylor's grave had recently been rediscovered. His body had recently been rediscovered, having been buried over, covered over. And he said, if you can get to this town, you'll find it. So let's consider that your very brief overview to the life of Hudson Taylor. He was born in England, he traveled to China as a missionary, and it was in China that he began to do missions in a new way, in a way that proved very effective. Many missionaries would move to a country, but really retain their British or American dress and customs. Taylor wanted to assimilate with the Chinese. Really, he became Chinese for the sake of the Chinese. While people at home tended to mock him for that, the Chinese respected him for that. And that was a large part of what made his ministry so very effective. We've arrived at the church, and it's an amazing building. There's a memorial tower outside that's been newly built specifically to remember Hudson Taylor and his great work here. Unfortunately, our contact is apparently not in today, despite making prior arrangements. So we're trying to figure out what to do, hoping we can find our way into that tower somehow to see what we've come all this way to find. In China, the common distinction between churches is between what are called three self churches. Those are churches that are sanctioned by the government. They are government churches. And then underground churches, which are the churches that are not sanctioned by the government and are often persecuted because of it. This church is part of that three self patriotic movement. Our contact there never did show up, but thankfully the custodian was kind enough to let us in. That meant we had to give ourselves a self-guided tour, but thankfully, most of the information was in English. This series of tableaus goes through the life of Hudson Taylor, from his parents and their marriage and committing their first son to mission work in China, but never telling him that. To him committing himself to mission work in China, through his arrival and all the way around to his death. Over here is the Brighton Beach moment, which was particularly important to him, where he really became convicted he needed to start an organization that would approach China in a whole new way. The death of 3 children here, and the death of Maria. He suffered terribly through life. And here's a picture of the gravestone, Maria's gravestone.
As I set out to search the world for historical objects, I did put a few stipulations in place, and one of them is that I didn't want to include graves or markers or memorials as objects. But in the case of Hudson Taylor, I thought it was worth making an exception, and that's really because there's such a good story behind his grave.
Hudson Taylor died in 1905 and was buried in a Western cemetery here in town. Around the 1960s, that land was taken over and given over to factories, and so factories were built right upon the cemetery, and everything was lost. More recently, just a few years ago, the factories were torn down, and that gave people the opportunity to examine what was underneath it. They'd already figured out that the graveyard used to be there. Sure enough, they did some excavations, and they found the graves of Hudson and Maria Taylor. They'd already found the tombstones, now they found the graves, the bodies themselves. And so they exhumed them, and they brought them here to lay them to rest. Behind the tombstones is this wonderful quote from Hudson Taylor. He said, "If I had 1,000 pounds, China should have it. If I had 1,000 lives, China should have them. No, not China, but Christ." Can we do too much for him? Can we do enough for such a precious Savior? And he just leaves the question hanging there.
And it wasn't enough to simply bring his body to this property. They wanted to do more than that. So they actually built this tower as a memorial to him and as a fitting place to lay his body finally to rest.
It says in this placard here, every spiritual story can be traced back to prayer. So too, the China Inland Mission was birthed through prayer. And as you walk through this hallway here, it shows specific answers to prayer and how important that was to mission. So Hudson Taylor's prayer before going to China. And then he started to pray specifically for 5 workers, and here are the 5 workers who were able to go. Then he began to pray for 24 willing, skillful laborers, and here they are. And appealed for 18 more. And it goes all the way around to the Cambridge 7, prayer for 100, appeal for 70, call for 200. So time after time, specific prayers answered specifically by God, meaning to show that there simply cannot be gospel advance where there hasn't been prayer. Prayer has to be instrumental, not supplemental. It has to go out before we act.
Of all the hundreds of exhibits I saw over the course of my travels, I really think this was one of my absolute favorites. Now maybe that was in part because of where I saw it. Here at this government-sanctioned church, it just seemed so out of place, and yet it was so powerful, so moving. And then it was such a stirring reminder that our God hears our prayers. Our God answers our prayers. And this wall, just as it showed all these prayers offered and prayers answered, it reminded me that we as Christians must pray. If we expect to see the gospel go forward across the world today, we must commit ourselves to prayer. I was privileged to spend this day with a friend who's a pastor of an underground church in the area. As we traveled from place to place, I took the opportunity to ask him a few questions.
So the first question I want to ask then is, how do Chinese people today perceive Hudson Taylor? And maybe you can distinguish between Chinese Christians and non-Christians.
For obvious reasons, we can't show you his face, and we need to disguise his voice.
I think for Chinese Christians in China, they see Hudson Taylor as a mission hero who introduced Christianity into China. Because before Hudson Taylor, there are different and many mission efforts, but not very successful because those missionaries are not willing to live and act like Chinese. But Hudson Taylor started that. He introduced 200, 400 missionaries into China doing it that way. And he started a church that is not relying on foreign mission societies. and he died in China. He did a lot of education and things associated with hospitals, so I think he earned a very good reputation for missionaries and Christianity in China. But for non-Christians, because of the government, in the government education propaganda, they tried to erase all the marks of missionaries in Chinese history. So most of the Chinese people, they don't even know that before missionaries came, there's no hospitals, no public hospitals in China. There's no public education in China. Yeah, so I don't think many Chinese people know about Hudson Taylor. It's just in Christian circles.
So what are we looking at here? Is this typical in a registered church?
Yes, it's typical in all registered churches.
And so outside the church, they'll post placards with this material, and they'll post the government regulation.
Right, yeah, it's required. I mean, since I think starting from last year, they required all the 3 self-churches to have the government regulations plus the socialism values.
And this is what stands out to me, just this confusion. Here you've got a registered church and one that seems to have compromised. You go into the sanctuary, you can see surveillance cameras that are monitored by the government. You go outside and you see all these rules of a socialist state. And then you go into the tower and there's this amazing, fitting memorial to a great man. I was never able to resolve that conflict in my mind. And while I had the opportunity, I wanted to ask my friend about the state of the church in China more than 100 years after Hudson Taylor's death.
Why can't we show your face?
Because I don't want to be identified, since your video is going to go public.
What's the danger in that, being identified?
I'm afraid that if some people use this video and show it to the government saying that this guy is saying bad words about our country, then I will get into trouble.
Would you say the church in China is persecuted?
It is in a certain way, but I won't say it's the same level of persecution compared to Iraq or North Korea.
Yeah. So what does it look like here?
It's that if you're gathering, if it's a religious event and you're gathered together, then being reported to the police, they may come and try to dismiss you. And if you rent a place for gathering, the police may ask the landlord to cancel the contract so that you have to find a new place. So that's the main inconvenience caused by the persecution.
A very healthy, thriving underground house church movement.
Thank you for asking that. So in my opinion, it's very difficult to have a big picture of the churches in China because we are hidden and there's no public website, no public journal. So people don't know each other and we don't know what other churches are doing. But from my point of view, I don't think it's as good as what our Western friends think. There's a lot of prosperity gospel stuff, and there's also a lot of people using Christianity as a way to earn money, to sell their own products like spiritual water, to drink and cure every disease. And there are also many house churches that are faithful to the Bible, but they don't know how to lead, to disciple, to discipline church members. So yeah, I would say it's very complicated.
My time in China had to be short, and that's because of my visa situation. I wasn't able to secure a long visa. I had only a couple of days. I was only able to go within a couple of provinces with severe penalties for leaving, and so I had to keep my time short and very quickly move on. I timed this whole trip around a conference in the Philippines. I had been invited there to speak and thought I would take a day or two beforehand to explore Manila to see if there's anything there that would tell the history of the church in the Philippines.
I'm here in Manila in the Philippines to speak at a conference over the next couple days, but we had this open day to explore the city a little bit. And what we found is the oldest Protestant church in the Philippines. And it's still relatively new. Catholicism had already been here for hundreds of years. It was only in the late 1800s that Protestants began to arrive, began to preach the gospel, and wouldn't you know it, the Methodists arrived first.
And also the cathedral was similar.
For hundreds of years, the Philippines was firmly under the grip of the Roman Catholic Church. Behind me is the cathedral that is considered the mother church of the Philippines. In fact, the Pope recently officially named it in that way.
This is maybe just a little bit of a silly fact, but my Filipino friends insisted I include it.
One thing I've learned since arriving in the Philippines is they proudly have the longest Christmas season in the world. Apparently, it starts around September 1st, continues all the way through until early January. So it's early November here already. Things are in full swing. You can see they're decorating this tree behind me. We've seen Christmas trees all over town already.
The Philippines is a bit of an outlier in the world in that it's an Asian nation that's predominantly Roman Catholic. In fact, it's one of the most Catholic nations in the world, with over 80% of its population professing that faith. Even though Portugal was the first European nation to encounter the Philippines, it was the Spanish who were most influential, and they brought their Catholic faith with them during the colonial era. Really, it wasn't until the very end of the 1800s, when America became influential in the Philippines, that Protestants were finally allowed to share the gospel. I never did find any objects that jumped out to me or that really told the story of the history of Christianity in the Philippines, but I did meet some amazing people. I thoroughly enjoyed the conference. I enjoyed worshiping with those new friends. My homeward journey took me through Korea, and I was really excited to see South Korea. The churches of my childhood had many connections here. I had heard so much about Korean believers and the church here. I needed to go and explore. Now I'll admit, I had a little bit of trouble with this museum just because the great majority of information was in Korean rather than English. There was some English, but the most substantial exhibits were only in Korean. I don't read Korean, so I had to put the pieces together as best as I was able. One thing that became obvious was a great love for the scriptures. You could see this long history of translating scripture into Korean to give it to the Korean people. That was very moving to me. And another thing that stood out to me was the copy of the Pilgrim's Progress they had there. It was fun to look at it and to realize they had contextualized the story. And so the characters had very obviously Korean features. They were dressed in very obviously Korean dress. It was fun to see how they had shaped the story to the audience. From there, we headed to a cemetery where foreign missionaries have been buried for over 100 years. A couple of the memorials stood out to me. One was for Robert Hardy, a fellow Canadian who came from very close to my hometown. Though he ended up being buried back in Canada, two of his daughters died and were buried here in Korea. The other was for Ruby Kendrick, who hailed from Texas. Her memorial reminded me of Hudson Taylor. She said, "If my work here in Korea is to be so short, I want to write to the young people at home to come and take my place." The epitaph on her tombstone echoes Hudson Taylor, "If I had 1,000 lives to give, Korea should have them all." I found the Foreign Missionary Cemetery profoundly moving. This is where many of the original missionaries to Korea were laid to rest, and sometimes laid to rest with their children. I found graves for Christians from all around the world who willingly left behind home and family to bring the gospel right here. And now, not that much later on, Korea is sending out so many missionaries of its own. Having heard so much about China and South Korea, and having known so many Filipinos, it was a blessing to be able to visit these three countries. There was so much I saw and so much I experienced. But what stood out to me as I sat through that long flight home was Jesus' parable about planting seeds that sprout and grow into a great harvest. Today there are millions of believers in each of these countries, and it struck me that they all grew up from the seeds planted by just a few faithful preachers of the gospel.